All right, let's get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man wala amma ba'd. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we're gonna go over the reading first, from pages 55 to 59, and then go over the slides as usual. So this particular topic is necessary, obviously, for every person to be aware of, especially as students of knowledge. Not every piece of information that you learn is something that has to be directly related to you or applicable to you. As students of knowledge, you obviously want to first and foremost learn for yourself, but at the same time, inshallah, if you're ever in a position to be a resource for others, even if it's for your own family, then that's a secondary benefit of learning, right? So the basics of the chapter of menstruation, postnatal bleeding, and dysfunctional uterine bleeding is part of the chapters of Tahara that gets studied by every single person. The basics are for everyone to know and to be aware of, and I will confirm with you next week, but Sheikh Aisha usually does a more in-depth seminar with the sisters on this topic, and I'll ask if she's planning to do it again this year. And obviously, it's because this topic can become very complicated, because what you are basing the rulings on are, people, and every person is different, right? Every person is different, and small differences can basically lead to different rulings, right? So nonetheless, we'll still try to cover as much ground as possible, inshallah. So if there are any questions from the reading itself, we'll do that first.
I had a question on page 56.
Okay.
It's about entering a masjid, even if only to pass through.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think I've heard, like, if people aren't praying in the musalla, then it's fine. Or if it's like a side musalla, if it's like the NPR or something like that. I've heard different things. So
yeah,
if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah. So it's something that we're going to talk about when it comes up on the slide also. But in the classical, traditional definition of masjid, nothing else happened but salah in the masjid. In other words, an area or a building structure was dedicated solely or primarily for the purpose of praying salah, right? Our masajid today are very multi-purpose, right? Even the actual musalla area, for example, is multi-purpose. It's not just where salah happens, but lectures, workshops, classes and so on. Many other things can happen, especially masajid that have smaller spaces, right? The larger masajid can have like a dedicated multi-purpose room. They can have like side rooms and things like that. But generally speaking, most masajid don't have one area where they only pray and they don't do anything else. Does that make sense? And that's the area that's being referred to here. That if it's such an area where it's primarily just for salah and you have to pass through, this is applicable to men as well, who are in the state of major impurity. And this would come up, for example, when men are in the masjid in Ramadan doing i'tikaf, right? When you're spending the last 10 nights in the masjid during Ramadan and a person is in the major state of impurity, they have to leave the masjid area immediately so that they could take a shower, right? So they can't remain in it. So this is what it's referring to. So because our definition of masjid is more relaxed, the majority of our spaces are multi-purpose use. The general idea is that if you want to be present in those areas, then just taking precaution to ensure that all impurities are taken care of. But beyond that, it's okay, right? Perhaps it's not the best, but it's okay, especially because when it's not being used for salah at that moment, it has a different purpose, right? The other madahib have kind of different rulings as well. The Hanbalis, if I'm not mistaken, for example, say that it's okay to be present in an area which is completely dedicated to salah, as long as they remain in the back and the impurities are taken care of, right? Again, you have to keep in mind that pre-modern times, when all of the hygienic and sanitary items that are found today was not available at that time, and any other thing was used, the possibility of impurities getting on one's clothing or elsewhere was very high. Does that make sense? Versus how it is today. This is a question that came up when Sheikh Ahmed and I went to Jerusalem. This was in 2022. This was in 2022, the summer, and we had a group with us, and my wife and my older son, who was the only one at that time, they were with me, and somebody asked my wife the question to ask me, and it was obviously important, simply because Masjid al-Aqsa, for example, doesn't have anything else other than salah happening, right? We would have our halaqas or lectures at the back of the masjid, in the back, on the side of the masjid or something, but you don't see anything else happening because they're not allowed to. So that was a concern, and that was kind of the opinion we suggested, that the Hanbali opinion allows you to be in the space, which makes it okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many institutes will take, if I'm not mistaken, the Maliki position, that it is allowed for teachers and students to recite the Quran and to continue memorizing. Whereas the Hanafi school takes a more stricter approach, and they say that during the cycle itself, if a person is to recite the Quran, they should limit it to the verses that are considered du'as as well, right? And if it's to recite any other part of the Quran, then to kind of break up the verse, either every couple of words or word by word, so that it's not a continuous recitation. Um, touching a copy of the Quran means to touch it directly, because even if you do make wudu when you are in a state of major impurity, you're not in a state of tahara, right? So you cannot touch a copy of the Quran unless it is with a non-attached barrier. This is something that we talked about. So if you have like a cover on top of the Quran, which is loosely, it's not even attached, it's more like you're using it like a mitt to hold the Quran to move it. That's what they mean by non-attached barrier. So, when you have like the cloth envelopes kind of that cover the Quran on both sides, that would be considered an attached barrier. Even though it's detachable because it's not permanently glued onto it, because it is, basically, kind of fixed to it, will be considered non-attached, right? It will be considered attached. Sorry. So non-attached would be something like you using like a scarf that you're not wearing, but you just use a scarf on your hand to move a copy of the Quran. That's what it would be referring to, right? So there are other positions within the other madhahib that kind of relax the rules of reciting the Quran and being present in a prayer of salah, in an area of salah. But more or less, everyone has the same type of principles. Mhm. Any other question?
On page 56,
Yes.
where it says, um, 122,
Yes.
where before talking about that the intermittent breaks within the 10 days would be retrospectively considered still as the period. And then the footnote says, however, every time the blood completely stops within 10 days, she must resume her blood for devotion. Like what does that mean?
Okay, so that's based on the text. This is on page 56, second paragraph. During the period of menstruation, i.e., its maximum 10 complete days, any color that is seen, as well as intermittent breaks from bleeding, again, within the possible 10 complete days, is considered menstrual blood, thus preventing her from praying or fasting. Footnote, however, every time the blood completely stops within the 10 days, meaning there is no color at all, she must resume her obligatory worship. So this is talking about a complete stop versus an intermittent stop, right? So everybody, more or less gauges what they would consider to be intermittent versus a complete stop for themselves, because it's not necessarily the same for every person. But complete means that there is no spotting anything else after that. Intermittent would mean a small gap, but then it would resume again, or there would be spotting and so on.
Mhm. So is this because of the rule that like came earlier about and anything that breaks I don't know, is it wudu? And anything that flows? Is that because of like that understanding?
Well, the menstruation specifically is mentioned in the Quran as something that requires ghusl, something that is a major state of impurity, and something that's understood as such from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So flowing blood is more so anything else. So from a wound, nosebleed, things like that, versus this, because this would be considered different. So, the flowing idea is not only tied to blood as well, because if somebody has pus coming out of a wound, for example, it would be considered the same, that if it flows, it would break your wudu, and if it stays stagnant on the place of the wound, right, then your wudu would be fine. Right? So the flowing is more so about, anything that could emerge from the body that is not, things like sweat or whatever, right? And that would be considered a nullifier of wudu if it was to flow out of the place of exiting, right? Yeah.
On page 55, where it's specified that 10 days and 240 complete hours.
Mhm.
So for example, like the editing period, and then like, for example, like on an international flight, and now you're in a totally different country time zone, I would use the hours since it began, not hours.
Yeah, yeah. You would.
Very
Yeah. So it would be based on the amount of time you've experienced and not the place you are in right now, even if there's a time shift or anything like that. Okay. Anything else?
Could you clarify number 2 on page 59? It's the condition of its continuity. It says,
Okay. So
yeah.
this is something that's going to come up when we talk about what constitutes an excuse, especially when it's something that is tied to breaking of wudu, right? So if, for example, a person has, if a person, medical conditions are generally the reason as to why you would have a chronic excuse, right? So say, for example, somebody who is continuously passing gas, right? That would break wudu, but it is to such a frequency that they don't have enough time to make wudu and just pray the fard. Does that make sense? So it's a continuous occurrence. So that's what we would call chronic. Now, so you have the medical term chronic, right? And you have the Shari'i understanding of what's chronic. The Shari'i understanding of a chronic excuse is anything that lasts for the duration of an entire salah period, or majority of the salah period. In other words, you don't have any gap in any salah period that would allow you to make wudu normally and just pray the fard. Are you guys following? So number 2 is referring to if something is chronic, but then it also stops and starts again, right? Then when would you consider it to be continuing versus not? Which means simply that if this excuse occurs even only once during the day and every salah time, that would be considered a chronic excuse. So it's not necessary. So say, for example, because of a medical condition, somebody has, somebody has an excuse and they're continuously or very frequently passing gas, right? It could be a temporary medical condition because of, some health complications or what have you, right? So if a person has something that's occurring frequently, okay, then that establishes the excuse. So say, for example, a person has this condition from Dhuhr to Asr. From Dhuhr to Asr, they have this continuously occurring condition. And right before the time of Asr finishes, which means right before the time of Dhuhr finishes, and they haven't been able to pray Dhuhr yet, then they would make wudu and they would pray with that condition because they've not had a chance or they've not had a long enough window to make wudu and pray without it occurring. Does that make sense? You guys follow? So if a person has this condition or any condition from Dhuhr to Asr, the way you would establish a chronic excuse is by you not having, say, for example, 10 minutes for you to make wudu and just pray the fard. If you have no such window, that means you have a chronic excuse. Okay. Now, how do you continue with that? In other words, how do you know if you can still pray with that condition, or you just have to wait until you find a window or something like that? Well, you don't, because from Dhuhr to Asr, you've established the fact that you have a chronic excuse. From Asr to Maghrib, if it occurs even just once, right, then a person will say, I'm in the state of being excused. That means they will make wudu and pray. In other words, they're not going to wait for the entire time to find a window. Okay? And say, for example, from Maghrib to Isha, nothing happened. Nothing happened, no occurrence of whatever. That means they're now not excused anymore, because one entire salah time has passed whereby it didn't occur. Are you guys following? Okay.
So it's only for one salah, or they can, if they have the wudu, they can do.
No, they're gonna make wudu for every salah. But the point is that how do you consider yourself excused versus not? And the way you would determine it is if it occurs even just once in any salah period, you would consider yourself excused. If it doesn't occur for one salah period completely, then you would consider yourself non-excused.
I think I asked this when we were talking about books, because we were talking about how you don't need intention for it, but I don't think you said it really clearly. So basically, like, also, based on what I was asking earlier about like how when if it completely stops within the 10 days, right? Like, so I could take a shower and I don't have to have the intention that like this is my like you know, it's almost like it's fully full shower or whatever, but I don't have the intention that I can do this because I'm not sure, but I can go back to the fact that, oh, okay, I made work, and so like within a period of it being soft within the 10 days, I can pray, and then okay, it comes back, that's fine.
Yeah, so generally speaking, within the duration of a cycle, even if it's within the 10-day maximum, any shower that a person takes without even the implicit intention that this is my shower to start praying would not be considered as such. Because say, you know, in a 6 so in a 6-day cycle, if somebody decides to shower on day 3, they're not doing so because they want to start praying, they're doing so because they're just taking a shower. So when a person does take a shower at the end of whatever they consider their cycle to be, that even if it's not verbalized, they know that this is so that I can start praying again. That's what would be taken into consideration.
And so you take
Yeah, so when it comes to determining what would be considered the end of a cycle, every person has to make that decision themselves, because, you know, again, every person's duration is going to be different. There's not a set standard, right? And that's what we call the habit, right? That's going to come up on the slides. It's how you would determine, you know, what's the most frequent for yourself, right? And on that day when a person takes a shower, then it is pretty much like 99% sure. They're 99% sure that, you know, my cycle is complete, right? So it's not going to be on the off chance that it stops. Most, you know, because you are determining the end of it based on how it occurs for that person, basically. And every person's habit is going to be different. Yeah. And it can get complicated because the habits themselves can be affected. because it is obviously health related. Many things can occur. Some of the most common reasons is obviously birth control, right? So any most birth control pills. This happens usually when people go for Hajj. They might take some medications that kind of, stop, their cycle for like, or it shifts it around basically. But for it to kind of reset and come back to like a routine, that takes a couple of months, right? So a person just has to be aware of it, especially when it goes beyond the standards, right? So how do you determine when to start praying, even if somebody's still bleeding, for example, right?
What you know to be like.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what a person has to base it on, right? And there are apps that help a person keep track, right? There are pregnancy apps that have that, as I'm definitely sure of it. There's an app called My Haith or something like that, some name related to that. It was put together by a group of men and women scholars, actually, that helps a person keep track. And it's helpful because, especially when it comes to things that go against what we would call the habit, how does a person determine, okay, do I still start praying? Because it can get very difficult, or it can get tricky, because again, every person has a unique makeup, right? So not everybody might see the same frequency of spotting, not everybody might see the same flow, not everybody might see the same way it ends. There's a lot of things to take into consideration. So it starts with keeping track of what would be considered the default for that person. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so let's get started with the slides. So today is week 10. Is week 10. So next week, inshallah, will be the last week for purification, right? And then we'll have 1 week of salah, 1 week of prayer before Thanksgiving break. And then, salah will continue up until end of February. End of, yeah, like mid to end of February, inshallah. So the goal is to hopefully get to the chapter of fasting in time for Ramadan. So it's timely. So it's, set up like that in your reading schedule. So inshallah, should be able to do so. But purification chapter is almost complete. All right. No. All right. So when we talk about hayd, which is the word for menstruation, we're referring specifically to the monthly cycle. Oh, sorry. Right. So Right, what the bod is referring to, monthly cycle. Now, the start of it is not set because again, there are a lot of things that are taken into consideration. All of us, have heard this, that a person's lifestyle, diet, uh, physiological makeup, and all of these things can have an impact on when puberty starts, right? So, for example, when it comes to the age of Aisha radiallahu anha and so on, if you read the paper that Yaqeen Institute had put out a couple years ago, very well done. You kind of realize that in pre-modern times, it was natural for puberty to start much earlier, simply because of the diet, simply because of the lifestyle, right? And puberty for both men and women has kind of shifted over the centuries, or at least the start of it, mainly because, again, of the lifestyle, of diet, and so on, right? So the monthly cycle is basically from the first appearance of blood, and that could be at any age, but there's an age maximum set, which is considered age 15 onward. And anything below 9 is not considered as like menstrual blood. Okay, so there's a minimum, and if there's nothing after the minimum, the maximum would be 15. Okay, so when we talk about a monthly cycle, so to speak, regardless of how many days a person actually has it, the minimum would be 3 days and 3 nights, right? 3 days and 3 nights, which is 72 hours, which means if a person experiences it for 65 hours, then they will tack on another 7, because it can't be less than 3. Okay, and if a person has their cycle go beyond 10 days and 10 nights, then at the 240-hour mark, basically, they would take a shower and start praying, even though there's still bleeding happening. All right. So there's a minimum and there's a maximum. This is necessary to have because when you don't have a habit, so to speak, or somebody's cycle fluctuates month to month for health reasons or what have you, then it's necessary to have a minimum and maximum duration, right? So all other days besides the monthly cycle days are called tuhur. These are the days of purity. These are the days of purity. And the days of purity are defined as 15 days or more. So minimum 15 days or more of no bleeding or any spotting between 2 cycles. Okay. So the word monthly, when you say monthly cycle, gives a very wrong impression because we think calendar month when it's obviously not a calendar month, right? So if you say, for example, one person has 15 days of tuhur in between cycles, then that means they would have another 2 weeks left in the month, so to speak. But you can't have your cycle itself be more than 10 days, which means basically in a 25-day period, 15 days are tuhur, 10 days are the cycle, and then it resets again to tuhur and then cycle, so on and so forth, right? So this is very key to not get yourself confused. Yes. Yes. No, 15 days is in between two cycles, so it's basically once one finishes and before the next one starts. In between, if there's no bleeding or spotting, then that would be considered a period of tuhur, right? And there is a minimum, because if a person is bleeding more, then that would not be considered a cycle. It would just be considered irregular bleeding, and a person would still be praying at that time. Okay. So 15 days or more is considered to be the minimum. 15 days and nights, which is 360 hours, is considered to be the minimum duration between two cycles. There is no maximum, which means a person can have 27 days of tuhur. Does that make sense? You could have 27 days of tuhur, and then you have 3 days of a cycle, and then you have 27 days of tuhur again. Does that make sense? So you have a minimum, but there's no maximum, because the maximum again, is going to be dependent on every person. Every person is going to have it different. Yeah.
Would you, if someone had their like months on end, would you like institute almost?
So if somebody has nothing for months on end, then they would just continue praying, right? And if somebody has continuous bleeding, right, and this isn't like postnatal bleeding, which is 40 days and so on, right? If somebody has continuous bleeding, then the minimum maximum days is how a person will establish some semblance. So they would say maximum 10 days of a cycle, and then 15 days of tuhur, and then 10 days of so on and so forth. So the minimum maximum is more so for a person who has irregular bleeding to establish a habit or a cycle for themselves. Does that make sense? Because if it's not naturally occurring, then it's going to be difficult to keep track of, and a person would determine it based on off and on days, essentially, right? So if a person's cycle is less than 3 days or more than 10 days, then that extra bleeding is considered istihada, which is irregular bleeding, right? As in, you will be able to start praying even if that is still happening, okay? Because it's beyond the 10-day maximum, right? And you will still not pray if it's less than 3 days, because the minimum has to be 3 days. Yes.
So the prayer would be valid after that point.
Yes. Right. So this would be similar to a person praying with a chronic excuse, essentially, that it is continuously happening, and because the excuse is established, a person would be able to pray even though it's still continuing. Right? So the most important thing to keep in mind is when we say monthly, we don't mean calendar month, like 28, 20, like 29, 30, 31 days. We're not thinking about it in that way, but rather a cycle that's maximum 10 days, minimum 3 days, and then with a period of tuhur in between two cycles, which is minimum 15 days, maximum could be whatever. And that's going to differ from person to person, right? Anything less than 3 days is going to be considered irregular. So you would fill the 3 days and then start praying. And then if a person bleeds for 11 days total, for example, then 10 days would be the maximum. They will start praying on the 11th day, even though they still have some bleeding. Okay. So when we say the flow of blood, or when we say bleeding is happening, we obviously don't mean it has to be continuously flowing, right? Because again, it's going to differ from person to person, but generally speaking, it's heavier in the beginning, right? It's heavier in the beginning. So, frequent changes of, like pads or whatever is used is going to be necessary. And then it kind of, slows down towards the end, or it might not, but it doesn't have to be continuous. Does that make sense? So, which means that within the 10 days, unless it's a habit, stoppage or spotting within the cycle itself is still going to be considered a menstruation, right? So if somebody has a 5-day bleeding cycle, for example, then within those 5 days, say for example, on day 3, it's very little bleeding. Does that make sense? It's very little bleeding. It's spotting after 2 days of heavy bleeding. That would not be considered the end of the cycle because a person has an established habit of 5 days. Does that make sense? And that's also why it's necessary to keep track of what would consider one's habit, because when you do have a stoppage or you have like spotting in between, you don't want to consider that as the end of the cycle, especially if you are, if somebody's, cycle is going to continue for another couple of days. Are you guys following? Make sense? Okay, so putting all of this into like an example, if someone has a 5-day bleeding cycle and 20 days of purity, their habit basically would be considered 5M, which is 5 menstruation, and 20P, 20 days of purity. Okay, that would be the habit of a person. And obviously that's 25 days, that's less than a month. So again, don't think of it as like, exactly like a calendar month, right? Because clearly the amount of days does not work out as such, right? So it's going to be a variation of this. Essentially, you have a fixed period of tuhur, and then you have a fixed cycle for hayd. Okay. So these are the bare bones that have to be kept in mind. So the minimum, maximum, right? 3 and 10 of hayd, and then the 15 minimum, no maximum of tuhur, that also has to be kept in mind. And irregular bleeding is anything less than 3, anything more than 10. Okay. So as general, rulings, number 1, very important to keep track, right? Specifically of start and stop dates, to establish and know one's habit, right? And this is something that usually when you have these types of workshops for younger girls, usually this is something that should always be emphasized, right? To get into the routine of keeping track, right? It's one of the reasons why, sometimes pregnancy is also like easier to track down, or because if somebody's keeping track of their cycle, then that's something that they'll also be aware of as well, right? But it's specifically tied to one's salah, right? So a person should absolutely learn how to keep track of it. So even if somebody uses an app or anything like that, that's absolutely fine. And there are many. So it's possible that the habit a person has can fluctuate month to month because, again, there are many factors that go into it, right? So somebody's habit could shift by a day or two. It's not necessarily going to fluctuate wildly, right? But sometimes even a day or two is not, it's not uncommon. Does that make sense? So fluctuation is a possibility, which makes it even more necessary to keep track of start and stop days, because eventually a person will be able to determine that it's always within like 6-7 days, for example, and kind of be aware of it. The most critical reason for knowing one's habit is when there is any irregular bleeding. when there's extra bleeding happening, then how would a person determine whether or not they should start praying? Okay. So, for example, if somebody has a habit of 5M, so 5 days of a 5-day cycle, but they bleed beyond the 10-day limit for 12 days total. So the key word here is the habit of 5M. That's what they're basing it off of. But in that particular cycle, they've bled for more than 10 days for 12 days total. So that person will consider 5 days of bleeding her cycle and the remaining 7 days as irregular. Even though 10 is the maximum, her habit is the one that's determining when she would start praying. Okay. So even though the entire cycle at that time has been 12 days, she would start praying on day 6 because based on her previous known habit, she's going to not pray for 5 days only. So it gets a little tricky, but it always comes down to what would one consider their habit. Okay. So when there's any fluctuation, they should be able to tell it apart. Yes.
In that scenario, she's not, if her regular menstruation period is 5 days, and then in 1 month, it ends up being 7 or 8 days.
Then
She's
on
not gonna
day
wait
6,
till-
yeah, exactly. She's not going to wait until it
Day-
finishes completely.
So
But
you don't have to
rather-
wait a minimum date.
Yeah. You're only going to wait for the maximum if it always is that or more to determine the maximum limit, right? But if somebody's habit is established as 5 days total, then on day 6, even if they're bleeding because of their habit, they would start praying, right? If at least a couple of months, it seems like the cycle has extended to 6 days or 7 days, then that would be now considered part of the habit. You won't base it off of the one-off occurrence, right? So it has to happen continuously in order for that to be considered the new habit, okay? So habits are critical when there is irregular bleeding because you have to start praying after maximum 10 days. So if a person is bleeding beyond their regular habit, right, they would start praying even though that hasn't stopped because they're basing it off of what they are used to. Habits are also critical to establish days of purity. So how do you determine the amount of time that you can be praying in between 2 cycles, right? So for example, if someone has 20 days of tuhur as a habit, but they continue to spot. They have 20 days of tuhur, but they continue to spot. The 20 days of tuhur will be used to determine what is irregular and what is the start of the next cycle. Because again, spotting, means that a person is no longer in tuhur. But if it is, below the established amount of days that they are used to, then that would just be considered as irregular and not the start of the cycle. So say, for example, a person on day 18 of their 20-day tuhur period, on day 18, they start seeing spots, which means their cycle is still 2 days away, right? They would still pray for the next 2 days because based on their habit, their 20 days of tuhur is not yet complete. So 2 days later, which is going to be the start of their cycle based on their habit. And because of that, early bleeding cannot always be considered menstruation. So sometimes it might happen like a day or two before blood is seen, right? You're not automatically going to consider it as the start of the cycle, even though the cycle itself is about a day or two away. You're not going to say it's It's just earlier this time. Because if it's not frequently occurring that way, you're gonna consider it as irregular and stick to whatever the default habit cycle is for the person, right? Are you guys following?
But in other words, it's someone's fault that that it changes just by like a day or two, it's not so precise and exact, then that could be counted as.
Exactly, right? So say for example, 1 month it's the spotting starts 2 days early, 1 month there's no spotting, 1 month it starts 1 day early. So that in and of itself won't be added to the habit unless it's occurring 1 day early almost every cycle for a good number of times, right? A person won't. And again, I think most people have at least an intuitive understanding that this seems to be the new norm, so to speak, right? And they would base it off of that. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So these again, because it's based off of every individual and every individual is different, the color honestly doesn't matter, because when we think of blood, we think of like bright red or dark red. Does that make sense? So it's not necessary that it has to be what we would consider to be the typical color of blood, because if it's any other shade or any other color, then that would still be considered menstrual blood, right? You might think that it would be obvious, but not necessarily, because it could very easily confuse a person also. Like, would they consider this to be part of their menstrual cycle or not, right? So the color itself is going to be based off of what it would be fresh and not after oxidization, right? Oxidation, right? So after it dries, so if you have a Band-Aid on, for example, and you take off the Band-Aid later, dried blood has different color than fresh blood, right? So a person is going to base it off of how it was when it was coming out, okay? Any other type of discharge, so when we say menstrual blood, we mean blood specifically, but any other type of discharge, whether it's white, clear, yellow, would only nullify wudu. So it's possible that before the start of the cycle, there's more discharge, but that discharge won't be considered part of the cycle itself. Does that make sense? It would only actually break the wudu. This is also the same for men, unless it is sperm. It's not going to require ghusl. It's not going to require an obligatory bath. Any type of presexual fluid, which is called madi, and any type of discharge that usually comes with urination, that usually comes when a person goes to the bathroom, those will only break one's wudu. Does that make sense? So any type of discharge doesn't automatically mean major impurity. Okay, so for men, it's sperm. For women, it's specifically menstrual blood, and those would require the obligatory bath. Okay. So this is, again, important to keep in mind, because especially when it's close to the cycle itself, if there's more discharge than usual, then it shouldn't be considered as part of the cycle itself. Does that make sense? However, this is considered before the days of habit. If yellow discharge is seen during the habit days itself, it will be considered part of the cycle. So within a 5 day cycle, if a person bleeds for 3 days and then on day 4 they only see yellow discharge, for example, it would be still considered part of the cycle because it's within the cycle itself. And then on the 5th day, if they're spotting or bleeding, it's still part of the cycle. And then on day 6, they'll take a shower because their cycle has finished based on their habit. Yes.
So the pattern that I'm seeing is, everything is based around the habit.
Yeah.
It's almost like whatever happens outside of the habit, don't take it as.
Yes.
So like, how many times does a change in the habit have to occur for it to be considered a new habit? So for example, if you're like 20 days, 5 days, 20 days, 5 days, how many days do you have to be on 7 days, 7 days for it to be considered?
At least 2 or 3 times. Because one time could be one off, right? 2 times gives you perhaps an indication that, okay, this might be a regular change. And this might just be the new norm, so to speak. And then on month 3, for example, if it happens again, then you would take it as that. But it gets tricky, especially when you have, because a lot of medications can sometimes, really impact the cycle, right? And not just, birth control pills or anything like that, but just any other type of health issues, right? So, all fluctuations won't automatically be considered part of the habit or the new norm unless it's occurring frequently.
Chef, I have a question. To follow up with that, so until you establish the new habit, do you just continue based on the original habit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then after 2 or 3 times, like you said, that's when we would establish the new habit and go based off of that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, for example, when like sometimes when you're sick or fasting, or when that changes, that so within this, we would take that, like, you're still gonna go back to your original habit, not because of the Senate.
Yes.
You wouldn't go based on just because of what you see, because of that. If you have
Yeah, you would still go off of your habit. So any spotting that happens before the established habit during the Tuhur cycle, during the Tuhur period, you would say it's still not part of the cycle. Mm.
So it's extremely important to track because after some time you have so much data that you can really.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's kind of the benefit. And it should be part of the teaching of the rules, right? Because ultimately, if somebody has a question, the question can only be answered based on the information that's given. So if somebody, for example, says, should I start praying or not? And they can't, confidently say that, I usually don't or do bleed for this long, then it would be difficult for an answer to be given like, okay, you should start praying versus you shouldn't start praying because it will be considered part of your cycle or not. Right? So it definitely should be kept track. And I think because of like, all of the apps and things like that, it's much more easier to do so, right? And obviously, it'd be easier to kind of look back and just track and just figure out the data, right? If necessary. Okay. So there's obviously much more details, many more scenarios, and those things. If Sheikh Aisha has her class with the sisters, I'll let you all know, inshallah. And otherwise, this is kind of the basic outline of what a person has to keep in mind for the menstruation itself. When it comes to postnatal bleeding, there's no minimum, right? There's no minimum because, if somebody, for example, stops bleeding after 10 days, then that would be considered okay. If somebody bleeds for 60 days, right, then 40 days would be considered the maximum, and then on day 41 they will start praying. Does that make sense? Because beyond 40, it would be considered irregular bleeding, because the rules of postnatal bleeding are like the rules of menstruation. So there is no minimum. Could be a couple of days, could be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, could be a month. But as soon as their bleeding stops, they will start praying as normal. And if it's continuously bleeding for 40 days or more, day 40 is the last day before they would have to start praying. Okay, so anything beyond 40 days is considered irregular, and all non-permitted things will now again be permitted. So based on, what opinions they follow, most importantly, of course, is the fact that their salah will now be obligated again, right? Okay. Any questions on this? Yes.
Maybe I missed this earlier, but where did we get the like number of 25? Or like when we were getting to 25?
No, that's just an example that I came up with. Because so you're not basing it off of the lunar month per se, because the lunar months are going to be either 29 days or 30 days, right? So there's no maximum tuhur period, right? Which means a person, for example, can have 30 days of tuhur and then 3 days of a cycle and then 30 days of tuhur again. Does that make sense? Which would obviously put it beyond the quote unquote month, right? Which is why I said, don't think of it like that, simply because, the amount of days that a person might have with the minimum maximum of tuhur and hayd might amount to a month, might amount to less than a month, might amount to more than a conventional month. Yeah. So it should just be considered like one entire cycle in and of itself. So both menstruation and postnatal bleeding, obviously they have fixed durations. So there's a minimum and maximum for both, 3 and 10 for menstruation, no minimum for this, maximum is 40 days, which means the third type of typical bleeding, which is irregular bleeding, is anything beyond those two. Okay. So irregular bleeding, which is called istihada, is if a person for their menstruation is bleeding less than 3 days or more than 10 days. Okay, bleeding less than 3 days or more than 10 days, then that would be considered istihada. If it's more than 40 days after giving birth, meaning postnatal bleeding, that would be considered irregular. If it's before the age of 9, right, that would be considered irregular, because the minimum age of puberty is 9 and up, right? And irregular bleeding is, what we would essentially call intermittent spotting that occurs, outside of the cycle. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So if irregular bleeding is anything outside of menstruation and postnatal bleeding, what is a person permitted to do during this time? Number one, they're still going to be praying all of their salah, because it's considered to be outside of their habit or outside the maximum period, right? So they'll make wudu for every salah. Because technically speaking, that would break their salah. And they would also clean if necessary to, so for example, switching out the pads if needed, but they would be praying like as normal. Number two, they would be fasting again, right? So 10 days of a cycle during Ramadan, and then day 11, 12, they're still bleeding, then um they would fast, right? Number three, touching and reading the Quran. This for the Hanafi school specifically, right? Because the Malikis are more relaxed when it comes to reciting the Quran during the cycle. But for the Hanafis, you should recite only the verses that are considered as du'as, or if you have to teach, you would recite in a way where you're not continuously reading, which means breaking up the ayah, every couple of words, right? And lastly, obviously it's not, it's permitted. Whether somebody chooses to do so or not is up to them. But being intimate again is permitted within the irregular bleeding period. Whether, we're not talking about medical outlook on this, right? We're just talking specifically from what is permitted versus not permitted, right? So during menstruation, during postnatal bleeding, intimacy is not permitted. And during irregular bleeding, it is permitted, but again, just because it's permitted doesn't mean that a person should. Any questions? Okay. So obviously we went over some of this already, but just to have a list. So the can and cannot do's during menstruation and postnatal, because all of this obviously can be done with irregular bleeding because it's not considered part of these two. So what a person can do during menstruation and postnatal, number one, dhikr, salawat, and dua. Dhikr, salawat, and dua. Person can continuously do so. Number two, reading Quran without voice. Basically reading it in your mind. Or even, obviously, that's going to come up, but listening to the Quran has nothing to do with the state you're in, so you can do so. But reading the Quran with voice, continuous recitation, no. But if a person reads the Quran without voice, then that's absolutely fine. Number three, reading the verses of the Quran that have the meaning of dua. So, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنْتَ سُبْحَانَكَ إِنِّي كُنْتُ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ. Any of the verses of the Quran that are considered to be du'as can still be recited. We talked about this in the beginning of class, touching the Quran with its detachable cover or a separate cloth, right? If you are cleaning the shelf, for example, you don't have wudu, then you can, or you're in a state of major impurity for both men and women, you can use a separate cloth to grab the Quran to just move it to the side. Reading religious literature with verses of the Quran in it. So if you're reading books of tafsir, books of hadith, for example, and there's a verse of Quran, then you could read that, but as long as you don't touch the verse directly. This is the same idea when it comes to whether or not you should touch a book of tafsir without wudu, right? obviously for both men and women. Generally speaking, books of tafsir, you can touch them without wudu because the words of tafsir are more than the words of the Quran. Does that make sense? So it's not technically considered the Quran. Even Quran translations that have the Quran side by side, the translation in words would be more than the words of the Quran, so it's not technically the Quran. All right. If you are touching a translation of the Quran that only has the translation, that's absolutely fine as well. We are talking about what we call the Mus'haf, basically. Listening to the Quran, right? Absolutely fine. Teaching the Quran by reading a word or two at a time. So you break up the verse, but teaching someone how to read is still considered permitted. What you cannot do, right? And again, this is during menstruation postnatal, because during irregular bleeding, you can do all of the following. Number one, obviously, you cannot pray. Number two, you cannot fast. Number three, no intimacy, having relations. Number four, doing tawaf. Tawaf has to be done in the state of wudu, right? Tawaf has to be done in the state of wudu. This type of question will come up again when we talk about Hajj and Umrah, for example. So Hajj and Umrah is the last chapter of the book, right? Because a person has to be in the state of wudu, how would they navigate something like this? And lastly, entering a masjid. And obviously we talked about how the masjid was defined in pre-modern times, classical times versus today. Now the tricky question is obviously the Haramain. Haramain obviously are solely dedicated for Salah and nothing else. So, some suggest that it's best to, remain in kind of like the courtyard area, or if a person wants to enter, then not going too far in, and obviously taking all precautions, right? Because some of the other madhahib do allow it. But it shouldn't be done with no reason. For the most part, our masajid, because the musalla areas, the entire structure is dedicated to a lot of different things. A person can be present and they could participate with no issue. Any questions?
I think like in school,
Yeah.
for touching.
Yeah. So for HIF students, obviously, we do utilize the other opinions, right? In our musalla, for example, it's not only a musalla, like we have classes in there, it's more like a classroom, just as much as it is a musalla. And because we still have the side rooms as well, there are different options, right? Same thing with the upstairs area. It's not only for sisters to pray in, because classes happen upstairs as well, right? Yeah. So connected to the idea of irregular bleeding, you have what we call somebody who is ma'dhur. Ma'dhur means somebody who has an udhr, somebody who has an excuse, right? So what would we consider an excused person, right? According to the Sharia. So a chronic excuse is defined as the following, not medically. This is in terms of the Sharia. It's a continuous illness that does not stop even to make wudu and pray. Even if it's like 5-10 minutes, right? If somebody doesn't have even that much of a window, then that would be now considered a chronic excuse. For example, a nosebleed, right? Sometimes people have heavy nosebleeds, right? It's not stopping, for whatever reason, that would be considered that. Sometimes because of medical conditions, age, leakage of urine, is very common, right? And we're not talking about, drops here and there. We're talking about a constant flow, right? A bleeding wound. Now, keep in mind when we say bleeding wound, we mean something that hasn't been covered up or is not being like staunched by like a band-aid or something. So say for example, if somebody has like a cut and they have a band-aid, they have a patch on, and then they have like a wrap around it, it's still bleeding inside, right? It's still bleeding inside, but that won't be considered the same way because you have something on top of it, right? Even if it seeps through, for example, sometimes if you have like a band-aid on, but you can kind of see the spot of blood pooling within the band-aid itself, and the gauze part of it becomes dark, but it hasn't come out. Does that make sense? Then that won't be considered a bleeding wound. We're talking about an open bleeding wound. Okay? Irregular bleeding after the monthly cycle or postnatal bleeding, all of these things would be considered chronic excuses because they are continuous, and if they don't stop for you to make wudu and pray, then what do? Well, you would pray with it, essentially. So there are three things to keep in mind. Number one, how does a person become an excused person, right? Somebody might have a nosebleed for like an hour. That doesn't immediately make you an excused person. Does that make sense? So to become excused, the excuse must remain during the entire duration of a salah time. That is, the excuse started before the salah time. So, example, Dhuhr time, in winter days, Dhuhr time starts around 11:30. Okay? At 11:15, somebody goes to make wudu, and in the process of making wudu, their nose starts bleeding. Can happen, dry nose, things like that, right? Your nose starts bleeding, and this is well before the time of Dhuhr. And for some people, when they have a nosebleed or when it starts, for some people, it's very difficult to stop. No matter how much they're plugging their nose, no matter how they're laying down, nothing seems to work. Does that make sense? Sometimes I have that issue. I remember a couple of years back during Hajj, I went to the Haram wudu area in Mecca to make wudu, and I started bleeding because it's extremely hot. And even though I was using like nasal sprays and things like that, nose got so dry that was constantly bleeding for like 10-15 minutes straight. And the problem is the water that I'm using is hot. So that's not helping either. And then these two like brothers from Pakistan, right? Allah bless them. They had like cold bottle of water. So one of them was like pouring it over my head, one of them was like pouring it over my neck, and that kind of slowed it down, right? So sometimes it's not easy to just stop. So say for example, a person goes to make wudu for Dhuhr. Dhuhr time hasn't started yet, or it's in the beginning time of Dhuhr, and they start bleeding. And Asr comes in at 2:30, right? Or 3 o'clock. Let's take the later time. Asr comes in at 3 o'clock, right? So literally from 11, so this is a rare occurrence for you to continuously bleed from like 11:30 till 3 o'clock. That's huge. Let's make it more common. Say from Asr to Maghrib, because winter months, Asr to Maghrib is very short, right? Actually, Maghrib to Isha, it's shorter. Maghrib comes in around 4:55-ish, 5-ish, right? And Isha is like around 6:05, 6:10. Just hour and 10 minutes, very easily somebody could be bleeding that entire time. So they go to make wudu for Maghrib, they start having a nosebleed, they can't make wudu and start praying because their nose is still bleeding, right? So they're waiting for their nose to stop bleeding until like 6, and it's almost the time of Isha. So what would they do? They're just going to plug plug their nose, they're just going to make wudu, and even if it's coming out while they're praying, then that will still be okay, because they will not be considered an excused individual. Does that make sense? So to remain excused, it has to continue to appear every salah time afterwards. So this might not be this might not be for a nosebleed, but think of someone who has like leakage of urine or passing of gas that occurs like not necessarily at fixed intervals, right? It's not like what they call it, Old Faithful, on Yellowstone, the geyser. It's not like that, right? But for the most part, a person knows that it occurs every hour, multiple times every hour, which means within a salah period, it happens at least once. Does that make sense? Within a salah period, it happens at least once, which means they are still going to be considered excused. They will make wudu even though it's still occurring, and then they will pray with it even though it's still occurring. Does that make sense? Question, Ali?
Yeah. So let's say someone was in the masjid, and then the salah time came in and they were doing the iqamah and everything. But then their nose started bleeding. Would they wait till their nose stopped bleeding, or would they be excused to join the jama'at? Does that
No,
make sense?
they'd wait for their nose to stop bleeding. They'd wait.
Sorry, can you
Yeah,
repeat that?
they would wait for their nose to stop bleeding, because catching the jama'ah obviously is a virtuous thing, but this won't qualify for that. Okay. So how does a person know that they no longer have an excuse? So the exemption of making wudu and praying with that condition goes away by the excuse not occurring a single time during the entire duration of a salah time. Okay. So, Asr to Maghrib during the winter months, like 2:30 to 5 or 3 to 5 if you take the later Asr time, right? Somebody has something that allows them to pray even though it's occurring, and then from Maghrib to Isha nothing happens, right? Maghrib to Isha nothing happens, which means that for Isha they would have to pray it with wudu, and they would have to pray salah without it occurring or anything like that, because they no longer have that exemption. Yes.
Those ways in the last, if they want to pray those, they think it's gonna last until Asr. But then right before Asr stops, then they would have to repeat that prayer.
No, so if it stops right before Asr, then they would just, and if it's still the time of Dhuhr, then they would pray Dhuhr, right?
Even if they pray,
Yeah, they don't have to repeat it, because so that's one of the reasons why the salah should be delayed to the end time, just so a person can gauge whether or not it's continuously happening, right? So say for example, a person wants to pray Asr, and Asr time has started at 3 o'clock, right? And they have a nosebleed, they're not immediately going to take it as an excuse and just pray with it, because it might stop and there might still be time for Asr, which means they're going to delay it up until the point where they might just end up missing it. So then they know that, okay, it's not stopping, I'm just going to pray with it. That's what they would do. Yes.
There's a whole hour period for salah, but you only have 10 minutes before you have to leave out when you are in the morning. So that those 10 minutes are is your time for salah.
Well,
You have no other way to pray during that time.
yeah, so a person can pray if they're, for example, if it's for a reason that they can't wait till the end of its time, then you could pray with it. But generally speaking, you can't consider an excuse because it hasn't been for the entire salah period. That's how you determine whether it's an excuse or not. So if a person won't have a chance to pray, then they just won't pray, and then they'll just make it up after. Right? Because again, it could go either way. There's no saying. Certain things are, if a person has a medical condition that's continuing for whatever reason, that would help them determine it, versus something that occurs one-off, like a nosebleed. That's hard to gauge whether or not it's going to stay for the entire time. But you can't consider that to be, a chronic excuse, by definition of the Sharia, if it doesn't last the entire Salah time. Mhm. Because otherwise, anything of this nature that occurs can be just considered an excuse, right? But obviously that's not the case. Okay. So that is the end of what we have set aside for today, inshallah. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll get started with tomorrow's pre-class material. That's the last lesson, inshallah. If we manage to finish it by 10, then we don't have class tomorrow. Right. And if we don't finish it, then we have class tomorrow. Yes. No, no, it's fine.
I don't know if this like falls into these practices, but so let's say those time started.
Yeah.
However many hours long, you didn't pray those in the first hour, you then get your period in the middle of it. What's like how do you when do you determine oh okay, now after my period I should make it up, versus you know what I'm saying? For example, in that
Yeah.
example, do you have to make up Dhuhr once you're?
Yeah. I'll have to double check. Yeah, I want to double check before. I'll double check right now.
Okay, and but for example, let's say you miss that, and then your period starts during those months, then for sure.
Yes.
Make up. Okay.
Yeah. So. Right, let's get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa. Wassalamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man wala amma ba'd. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. So, last lesson for our creed class, inshallah. We obviously went over all of the articles of Iman. So this wrap-up session is more of supporting issues, secondary issues that can come up as part of the discussions, some of which are going to be just us reading through some things, but for the most part, they do impact the main articles of belief as well. So it's, a very good way to kind of wrap up whatever we've been talking about so far. Right, so some of the supporting issues, some, not all, some of them, number one, belief about all of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Especially when you get into, Sunni Shia polemics, and you see, other representations of the Sahaba, radiallahu ta'ala anhum. It's very, very critical that a person has the correct belief about all of the companions, right? And not just some of the companions, and for the reasons that we'll go through, right? So, supporting issues, belief about all of the companions, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, in the correct way. Number two, adherence to the Quran and Sunnah, all right? Adherence to the Quran and Sunnah. Number three, adherence to the congregation of Muslims. In other words, the vast majority. All right. And this is key when we get to it. Whenever we say vast majority, we don't mean the majority based on your time and area. We mean all time. So from the time of the Prophet till today, we have majority minority positions. And a person should always opt to be part of the majority, because the Prophet said the majority of my ummah will not agree on a wrong thing. Does that make sense? So in our times, we might be part of the quote unquote minority, but that's not what you're basing it on. You're basing it on the majority of the ummah from the time of the Prophet. And lastly, kind of role of character, knowledge, and moderation in building faith. Because the entire discussion of Iman so the entire enterprise of faith is inner, spiritual, intellectual, right? That's what you are building your foundation on. And what goes into building your Iman alongside your amal, because clearly amal is your practices are a manifestation of your Iman, a result of your Iman. So when it comes to akhlaq, when it comes to ilm, when it comes to, being moderate, all of those are necessary in order to build your Iman as well. So these aren't like very complicated issues, but just some things to consider. So when we talk about belief of the companions, when we talk about companions, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, who do we first of all define as a companion? So Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, defines the companion as someone who met the Prophet ﷺ as a believer and passed away in that state. Okay, so the definition broken down, met the Prophet means they met in person. So for example, the king Najashi is not considered a Sahaba because he never met the Prophet. He accepted Islam, but he's not considered a Sahaba. Uwais al-Qarni from Qarn, Yemen, right? Who wrote to the Prophet ﷺ that I wish to come see you, but I'm taking care of my elderly mother. And the Prophet told him to remain and take care of his mother instead of traveling to see him. So he is not considered a Sahaba because he didn't meet the Prophet in person. So meeting the Prophet in person, even if it was for a moment in time or somebody who spent years and years with the Prophet and anything in between. Okay. Number 2, they met the Prophet as a believer. What does that mean? So when they met the Prophet, they believed in the Prophet. Either they accepted Islam at that time at the hand of the Prophet, or they were Muslim and then they met the Prophet. So somebody who meets the Prophet as a disbeliever, but then later on brings Iman, for example, would not be considered a Sahaba.
Even while the Prophet is alive. So for example, like someone met the Prophet and the Prophet passed away. Then he accepted Islam.
Yeah,
He's not a Sahabi.
not a
But when
Sahabi.
he met the Prophet, he was not a Muslim. Then he went back to wherever he is. He accepts Islam. He's still not a Sahabi.
Yeah.
Until he meets the Prophet as a Muslim.
Yeah. Right. So, because you have to determine the definition in a way that it's more or less based off of how majority of the people that we consider companions, what was their state. So say, for example, you had people like Khalid bin Walid, radiallahu anhu, Ikrama, son of Abu Jahl, who clearly met the Prophet, knew the Prophet, interacted with the Prophet before Islam. But then when they met the Prophet again, they accepted Islam. Then they were considered a Sahaba. Does that make sense? Abu Sufyan, same thing, met the Prophet as a non-believer, and then met the Prophet, accepted Islam, and then what is now considered a believer, right? So is it possible that someone, for example, met the Prophet in Mecca when he was giving da'wah during Hajj season, and then they went away, and then later on Allah gave them tawfiq to accept Islam that we don't know of, right? Is it possible that happened? Sure, that's a probability, right? So those individuals will not be considered companions, okay? And lastly, they passed away in that state. In other words, they passed away in a state of Iman. Because even though it was very rare, you did have people who believed in the Prophet at the hands of the Prophet, later on under pressure from the Meccans, for example, apostated, right? So they would not be considered Sahaba, obviously.
When you say meet, does that mean that to interact with him?
So they met the Prophet as in they at least saw the Prophet. They were in the presence of the Prophet, even if it was for a moment or a lifetime, right? Okay. So how do we know someone is a companion, right? How do we affirm someone being a companion of the Prophet? So the Quran, for example, gives us indications such as the verse in Surah Tawbah when Allah says, the second of two, when they were in the cave and he said to his companion, don't worry, Allah is with us. This is Prophet ﷺ telling Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu when they were hiding during Hijrah, right? And that indicates that yes, they were a companion of the Prophet, even though a name is not mentioned. Allah declaring that He is pleased with them. So when Allah says, Radiyallahu anhum, right, Allah is pleased with them, that would be a way of us determining who is considered a Sahaba. So people like Wahshi, people like Hind, radiallahu anhum, who accepted Islam much later, right? And obviously were staunch enemies before. They are considered Sahaba. And yes, there is a spectrum or ranking within the Sahaba because you have the Sahaba at the very top, but even the comparatively less or last ranked Sahaba is still better than the best of the Tabi'i because they have the one thing that the Tabi'i didn't, which is seeing the Prophet as a believer. Does that make sense? So that grouping is, centered on meeting the Prophet as a believer and then passing away as a believer. So if Allah says He is pleased with the Sahaba, then we will call them Sahaba. The hadith, for example, that gives the list of specific people, so the 10 companions who are promised Jannah, other names that the Prophet ﷺ mentions, the names other Sahaba mention as being companions, all of that helps us determine a list of companions, so to speak. And of course, the seerah, right? The seerah of the Prophet ﷺ gives us a good number of names. We don't know all of the names of all of the Sahaba. It's not, I mean, if you look at the most conservative estimates of Hajjatul Wida, the farewell Hajj, we definitely don't have that much names, right? But all of the people present at that time who saw the Prophet, listened to the Prophet, heard the last khutbah, are all considered Sahaba. Does that make sense? Yes. Like 100,000 above, right? So, think of like the Bedouin who came one time and met the Prophet and that's it. They're still considered a Sahaba, right? So we don't have the names of all of them, but you don't need to know the names in order to have a specific belief and idea about the group, about the category, which is what do we believe with regards to those who are considered companions. So before we actually get to that, it's worth reminding ourselves of the virtues of the companions. Why are they so important? Some of which is mentioned here. Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith of Sahih Muslim, the stars are a guarantee for the skies. When the stars are gone, the sky will be met with what was promised. In other words, when the stars are being destroyed, that means the day of judgment is there and the sky will also be destroyed. I am a guarantee for my companions. When I am gone, my companions will be met with what they were promised. In other words, my companions will also start to pass away. My companions are a guarantee for my ummah. When my companions are gone, my ummah will be met with what they were promised. So every generation is connected to the generation before them. In a hadith of Muslim and Tirmidhi, Prophet ﷺ said, do not abuse my companions verbally, right, or even physically. So this is kind of the hadith that we keep in mind when we are discussing the atrocities of the Umayyads, for example, Yazid in particular, against the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, right? And that's where it gets tricky, because when you look at Sunni Shia polemics, the discussion of Aisha radiallahu anha, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu is, depending on what spectrum of a book you read from the Shia side, it's very, very horrendous, literally, towards them, right? Specifically Aisha radiallahu anha, right? Because they consider her to be like an instigator or a main cause as to why Ali radiallahu anhu was not, kind of able to have like a stable rule. And of course, when it comes to like Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhu, by and large, by the 12-verse Shias, they're considered to be usurpers, as in they were the ones who kind of took the rightful claim of Ali radiallahu anhu and so on. So we don't sanitize history. We try to understand it as it is, as completely as possible, as holistically as possible. So when we read the narrations that talk about the aftermath of the death of the Prophet, figuring out how the Sahaba discussed leadership, you cannot deny the fact that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, when he was elected, right, by the Sahaba, those who were present did the decision making. Ali radiallahu anhu was not present. Ali radiallahu anhu took bay'ah to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu much later than everyone else. because of hurt feelings, essentially, right? So we don't discredit any of that just to fit our narrative, but we try to understand it in a way that they made the decision that they felt was the best, right? It's possible that Allah's will manifested the way He wanted it, right? Is it possible that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was the first simply because his calm leadership was the necessity in that moment when they are transitioning into post-prophet life? Does that make sense? Like, you need someone who could truly keep the community on track, right? So imagine somebody with the personality of Umar radiallahu anhu being the first Khalifa. That would be difficult because Umar radiallahu anhu himself had to be reminded by Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu that, hey, Prophet is just a man and he passed away, right? So from our understanding, and this is something that in year 2, inshallah, if you continue in year 2, Sheikh Tariq's class is about the Khulafa, right? That one is recording, so you don't have to worry about an extra class, right? It's about the Khulafa, and it starts with this because it's a genuine question that, and this is the reason, side note, this is the reason why politics is not treated as theology. It's not a matter of aqidah. The Sahaba made the best ijtihadi decision that they could in the absence of revelation. During the Prophet's lifetime, anything that they decided was confirmed or corrected by the Prophet by revelation. Post the Prophet, right, they had to make their best judgment call, right? So you are balancing historical facts between declaration of Allah that says radiyallahu anhum, which means being very careful in how you discuss these very sensitive things. You don't want to discredit or undermine or minimize or understate things that actually happened. Yes, there was a bloody civil war during the time of Ali radiallahu anhu between him and Aisha radiallahu anha, right? On one side you have the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, the other side you have one of the Azwaj Mutahharat, one of the, mother of the believers, right? That's a fact. And then you had it between Ali and Muawiyah radiallahu anhuma, both of whom were Sahaba. So and Sahaba themselves were split and on both sides. So for us to kind of retroactively say that these people were wrong, these people were wrong, after Muawiyah radiallahu anhu onward, everybody's fair game. Yazid onward, everybody's fair game. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions on books and talk about this in a good way?
I mean, majority of the books that you read should be fine. Everyone's gonna have a different perspective explanation, right? But Sunni books, basically, the ones that are kind of following the orthodox position of Sahaba, are going to be very careful of how they describe the decisions of the Sahaba, because you want to analyze the decisions without disparaging the person. So when we say Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu accepted Khilafah despite the fact that he might have known or at least understood how Ali radiallahu anhu might have taken it, you don't disparage one person or the other, right? Or you don't discredit the fact that, yes, there were some hurt feelings involved. Does that make sense? So for the most part, whatever book you read from the Sunni tradition, because of radiallahu anhu, because of this idea that we have about the Sahaba and we don't say they are infallible. Only the Prophet is infallible. Nobody after the Prophet is infallible, which means the Sahaba were also going to make human mistakes, and they did mistakes, right? But because of who they were and because Allah chose literally that generation to be with the Prophet during the Prophet's lifetime, right? And to be like the bedrock of the community, you have to give them the respect that they're afforded. Does that make sense? So, do not abuse my companions, for by the one in whose hand is my soul, if one of you were to spend gold the size of Uhud, it would not equal a mud, nor half of it. Mud is basically like about a couple of milliliters of water, like a bottle of water, or even half of that of one of them. Because there's no way we can catch up. Does that make sense? There's no way we could catch up. So this is just to impress upon us the status and rank of the Sahaba. In a hadith of Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ said, a time will come when groups of people will go for jihad and it will be asked, is there anyone amongst you who has enjoyed the company of the Prophet? The answer will be yes. Then they will be given victory. Then a time will come when it will be asked, is there anyone amongst you who has enjoyed the companions, who has enjoyed the company of the companions of the Prophet? It will be said yes, meaning the Tabi'i generation. And they will be given victory. Then a time will come when it will be said, is there anyone amongst you who has enjoyed the company of the companions of the Prophet, which is the Tabi'ut Tabi'i? Because the Prophet said 3 generations, خَيْرُ الْقُرُونِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُم, which means the best of generations is my generation, which is the Sahaba, the one after them, which is the Tabi'i, the one after them, which is the Tabi'ut Tabi'i, right? And it will be said yes, and they will be given victory. So this hadith can also be considered as one of the reasons as to why there was such rapid success in the first 3 generations, right? And on such a scale, despite all of the internal turmoils, right, and strife. This is the hadith that I just quoted from Sahih Muslim, which you hear in Jumu'ah khutbahs all the time. The best generation of my ummah is one in which I was sent, then the one to follow it. The narrator says Allah knows best whether he stated this a 3rd time or not. So it could be just the Sahaba and the Tabi'i, or the Sahaba, Tabi'i, and the Tabi'ut Tabi'i. Does that make sense? So we have a working definition of Sahaba, and we've looked at some of the reasons as to why they have the rank that they do, in addition to the virtues that the Prophet ﷺ himself mentioned. Now, what does this mean, or why is this emphasized so much? Because when it comes to loving the companions, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, there is an obligation upon us to love the people who were chosen to be with the Prophet. Does that make sense? So the love that we have for the Sahaba are not meant to be confined only to the family of the Prophet, only to certain individuals, because again, the family of the Prophet, again, is not just Ali, Fatima, and Hassan, Hussein, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, right? Because all of the Ummul Mu'mineen, family of the Prophet, all of the other people, part of the household of the Prophet, right? Like Ayman, radiallahu anha, Zayd, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and so on. They're also family of the Prophet, right? Abu Sufyan, Muawiyah, they're related to the Prophet, right? So you can't choose some family of the Prophet to love and not love the others. So it has to be a very balanced understanding, right? We love them because they were the ones Allah chose to be with the Prophet. So Allah says in Surah Hashr, and those that come after them say, meaning us, anyone who comes after this generation, they say, oh Allah, forgive us and our brothers. رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَلِإِخْوَانِنَا الَّذِينَ سَبَقُونَا بِالْإِيمَانِ. Right? Oh Allah, forgive us and our brothers who preceded us in faith. وَلَا تَجْعَلْ فِي قُلُوبِنَا غِلًّا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. And do not place rancor, hatred in our hearts for those who believe. رَبَّنَا إِنَّكَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. O Lord, you are kind and merciful. This is one ayah of a few that just is a caution that how we judge the people of the past should not be harshly. There's one of my teachers, ironically a Shia in college, right? Or I don't know how practicing he is, but I know he's a Shia. He said that it was a Islamic political theory class. So he was like, when it comes to studying the past, we don't accuse, nor do we excuse. Right? So accusing would come about as you projecting your understanding and values and framework of the world on a pre-modern past that had no notions of that. Does that make sense? So this comes into play when you are considering things like Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha's marriage to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So our understanding of childhood versus adulthood, what was considered the norms of society, the urf of society, all of those things, our framework is very different than pre-modern times. And this is across the world, because it's not something that is only found in 7th century Arabia. But if you look in pre-modern Europe, for example, especially amongst royalty, right? You know, you had the same notion of it was either childhood or adulthood. Does that make sense? In pre-modern times, alongside like industrial revolution, alongside, you know, the workforce and things like that, universal education, that's when you had this in-between period of adolescence, right? Which was between childhood and adulthood, right? If you're interested, read like Neil Postman's Disappearance of Childhood. It's a great book. You know, it really shows how there are a lot of categories that we take for granted, especially in how we conceptualize and think of the world, that literally didn't exist before. Does that make sense? So which means when we look back at the past, for you to judge others based on standards that they didn't even hold is not fair, right? This is something that we might sometimes experience when it comes to like intergenerational conflict, right? So how you might think of a certain issue versus your parents is going to be different based on frameworks. Does that make sense? Based on circumstances. So we don't accuse simply because it, not only because we don't have the same framework, but because they are Sahaba. But excusing means that, or not excusing means that we don't sanitize history. We don't say everything was perfect, nobody had any arguments, all of these things are lies and made up and so on. You know, they had no problems with each other and it was just a small mess-up. That's understating it. Does that make sense? That's doing a disservice to history. So, you know, Western academics will usually accuse, you know, quote unquote, practicing Muslims, you know, or confessional Muslims as to being biased. That, oh, you don't want to face the facts. You don't want to be, you know, as, you know, you don't want to strongly critique because there's like an investment in the narrative that we who are like rational and objective, you know, we don't have that investment. Immediately? Okay. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay. Okay. So then another hadith of Tirmidhi, when it comes to loving the companions, the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah regarding my companions. In other words, Prophet ﷺ is saying the name of Allah and then he talks about his companions. This is also mentioned in the khutbahs, Allah fi ashabi, la tattakhiduhum gharadan min ba'di. So, you know, Allah, like by Allah, I am telling you with regarding to my companions, do not take them as a target after me. لا تتخذوهم غرضا من بعدي فمن أحبهم فبحبي أحبهم. Whoever loves them, then with my love, I love that person. ومن أبغضهم فببغضي أبغضهم. Whoever hates them, then with my hate, I hate them. وخير القرون قرني. and that's part of the khutbah, but the hadith itself, whoever bothers them bothers me, and whoever bothers me has bothered Allah, and whoever bothers Allah is bound to be taken to task. So, not to be taken lightly, right? Not to be taken lightly. So it doesn't mean that we don't discuss what happened, right? It doesn't mean that we don't discuss what happened. However, we have to be very, very careful when doing so, because we don't want to fall under this hadith, right? Because having the displeasure of Allah and the Prophet ﷺ against you is not a small thing. Does that make sense? So Imam Tahawi, rahimahullah, whose book is usually studied in year 4, Shaykh Mudassir teaches it. Imam Tahawi said, we love the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. We do not go beyond bounds in loving them. That's supposed to be clear. In other words, when people talk about the Ahlul Bayt, we love the family of the Prophet because they are family of the Prophet, right? Because they are Sahaba, and the family of the Prophet sacrificed a lot, perhaps more than the average companion, but we don't go overboard in our loving them, nor do we absolve ourselves from them, nor do we hate them or mention them except in the best way. Loving them is deen, iman, and ihsan. Hating them is kufr, nifaq, and oppression. Okay? So it has to be a balanced approach. And clearly it's aimed at groups who would disparage the Sahaba, or at least some of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, at the expense of others. Right? Yes, there's a ranking amongst the Sahaba. The 4 Khulafa are considered higher. The Ashara Mubashara are there. You have the Ahlul Bayt, you have the family of the Prophet, which is from Khadija radiallahu anha onward, essentially. Right? You have the Sahaba who participated in Badr. They are in this own category because it was the first battle and they were the ones who participated in that first battle, and so on and so forth, right? So, you don't use those categories to kind of, make a ranking, because all of them are still considered part of that same group. Now, why are we talking about this? Not because of how a person might end up viewing the companions when looking at history, although that's obviously something that should be kept in mind. However, how's this related to everything that we've talked about? Articles of Iman, fundamentals of faith. Number one, the Sahaba are the primary recipients of revelation. They are the ones who we learn the Quran from. They are the ones who we learn the Hadith from. So if you disparage the Sahaba and you say that some Sahaba cannot be trusted, then by virtue of that, how can you trust anything any Sahaba says? So by you denying the Sahaba, you have denied your main connection to the Prophet. And in the absence of Sahaba, you have no connection to revelation. Does that make sense? So, saying things like, the Mus'haf of Uthman, excluded some ajza of the Quran or some surahs of the Quran is literally not just going against the ayah of the Quran that says that we will protect the revelation, but you are kind of casting an aspersion that would taint everything that you get from the Sahaba. That includes the seerah, that includes the hadith. Anything that comes from the Prophet comes through the Sahaba, right? So denying them would mean that you deny the Quran. They are the transmitters of the religion. Not believing them means that we obliterate what they have transmitted. Okay? So the Quran, because the Quran, you guys are doing it in Shaykh Tariq's class, right? Quran was compiled during the time of the Sahaba, right? Even though it was written down during the lifetime of the Prophet. The Quran comes from them. The Hadith comes from them. The concept of ijma', right? That's something that we talked about in fiqh, right? That's something that we talked about in fiqh. And that ijma' and what eventually came to be known as qiyas, ijtihad, was from the time of the Khulafa Rashidun, right? So if you deny the Sahaba, you're denying one source of evidence for the Sharia, which is ijma, right? And then it also affects the other main sources, which is the Quran and Hadith. So in a nutshell, have to be very, very careful about how we speak of them. Okay. I have a meeting to get to. So for tomorrow's class, all of you can be online. Nobody has to come in person unless you have to come here. But it'll just be literally the last 3 slides. Right. Actually, let's just complete it. I think that would be much easier. I can afford to go 5 minutes later. Okay. So when we talk about the adherence to the Quran, Sunnah, and congregation of Muslims, why is this important? So when a person has the fundamentals of faith, when they have articles of Iman, how is it supported? It's supported by sticking to the sources. Does that make sense? So you stick to the Quran, you stick to the Sunnah, you stick to the concept of Ummah, right? Congregation, Jama'ah. That's the idea of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Ahlus Sunnah, people who follow the Sunnah. Jama'ah, people who follow the majority, people who follow the companions, right? So Allah says in Surah Ali Imran, O you who believe, be mindful of Allah as He should be minded, and do not die unless you are Muslims. Adhere altogether to Allah's rope, and do not split apart. Right? وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Don't split apart. Because, that saying the lone sheep is always a target, right? So being part of the Jama'ah, being part of the community is a way of protecting oneself. Right. And of course, not just the community, because think of what's the smallest unit outside of the individual? What's the unit above the individual? The family. So concept of family, like the household, right? Think of the hadith where the Prophet talks about everyone as a shepherd for their household, right? Because you can't. Community is vast, it's diverse, and it's messy. Everyone has their own agenda, everyone has their own type of thing, right? Who you are directly responsible for is Qu anfusakum, yourself, wa ahlikum, your family. Everyone else is secondary, like it or not, right? Everyone else is secondary. You worry about yourself, you worry about your family first and foremost. So the nuclear family is the smallest unit of what we would call jama'ah, congregation. And all of those put together is what we call a jama'ah, right? Qatada says that do not split up and remember Allah's blessings. He has disliked fracture and forbid you from it. He warned you from this and instead is instead is pleased with you to hear and obey, to be kind and congregate, to be pleased for yourselves with what Allah is pleased with for you as you are capable, and there is no strength by Allah. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu said to one of his students, Simak al-Hanafi, the congregation, the previous nations were only destroyed due to their differing. Have you not read Allah's statement, adhere altogether to Allah's rope and do not split apart? Right? Okay. So we cannot underestimate the Quran and Sunnah and the congregation when it comes to building Iman and when it comes to simply having it as a part of our lives, right? A person cannot be Muslim without the Quran and Sunnah, right? And it cannot be supported without the congregation, without the Ummah, right? When we talk about character, knowledge, and moderation in building faith, So these aren't small things, right? Because whenever we think of Iman, whenever we think of like theology or theological sciences, we tend to underestimate things like adab, etiquettes. We tend to underestimate what it means to develop one's character and behavior, right? Because those things ultimately does impact how a person believes. It impacts their outlook. So this is just a long quote that I'll read through because it kind of summarizes this entire concept and pretty much the class, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he said in his book Al-Aqidah Al-Wasitiyah, thereafter, along with these fundamentals, they enjoin good and forbid evil. They, as in the believer, enjoin good and forbid evil according to what is required by the law Sharia. They regard as obligatory establishing the Hajj, Jihad, Jumu'ah, celebrating holidays with the leaders, whether they are righteous or wicked. That's a very specific political theory. Again, you have a spectrum of Islamic political theory when it comes to rebelling against rulers, when it comes to obeying the rulers, even if they are, like organizing raves and such, right? Hint, hint, right? You kind of have all that discussion because of, it's a spectrum. Ita'atul Amir is not simple or as simplistic as people make it out to be. And they preserve congregational prayers. They offer sincere advice to the Muslim nation. They believe, meaning the Muslims believe in the meaning of his saying, peace and blessings be upon him, meaning the hadith of the Prophet. Verily, the believers are like a structure, each one strengthening the other. And he held up his two fingers together to illustrate. And his saying, the Prophet's hadith, the parable of the believers and their affection, mercy, and compassion for each other is that of a body. When any limb aches, the whole body reacts with sleeplessness and fever. They enjoin patience at a time of hardship, gratitude at the time of prosperity, and contentment with the difficulties of providence, in other words, qadr. They invite others to have noble ethics and to perform good deeds, amar bil ma'ruf, and they believe in his saying, peace and blessings be upon him. The most complete of the believers in faith are those with the most excellent character. They encourage you to maintain good relations with those you cut off, silatul rahim, to give to those who deprive you and to forgive those who wrong you. They order righteousness with parents, maintenance of family ties, good neighborliness, good treatment of orphans, the poor, the traveler, and gentleness with servants. They prohibit pride, vanity, transgression, and disrespecting the creation, whether it is deserved or not. They order the loftiest ethics, and they prohibit foolishness. All of what they say and do of this, among other things, is only due to their following the book and the Sunnah, the Quran and Sunnah. Their way is the religion of Islam, for which Allah has sent the Prophet ﷺ. Character essentially reflects a person's belief and how well that belief has, come within them, right? Which is, of course, the purpose. If you had to summarize this, you cannot have Islam or Iman without ethics. You can't have Islam or Iman without ethics, and we have ethics in every part of our deen, right? Because it's not just about a set of beliefs, but how that belief system informs your actions, constructs your worldview, helps your reactions, your proactions, all of that combined. All right. That was a bit of a rushed ending, but if there are any questions, we can go over it on Thursday, inshallah. There's one question of a point from page 84 of the Ascent to Felicity book about wiping over khus. So anything that nullifies wudu invalidates the wiping of khufs. That simply means that when it comes to actually, I'll look it up because I know it's a little confusing. But I understand where the question is coming from, so I'll look it up and show you. As for your question, so the Hanafi school says that if somebody is in the time of Dhuhr and they haven't prayed Dhuhr, and then 1 hour in the time of Dhuhr, their cycle starts, they do not have to make up their salah after their cycle finishes, because it will be judged based on their state in the last time of that salah, which means were they in a time of purity or not. So if somebody is it's the reason why when a person stops, when their cycle ends and they make ghusl, they still have to pray the salah of the time that they're in, because they would end it in a state of purification, right? So for the Hanafi school, you don't have to make it up. For the Shafi'is, you do have to make it up, because of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which says that if a person gets even 1 rak'ah, then they have caught the jama'ah, which applies to the congregation. But that hadith is used to also suggest that if a person has even one moment to pray 1 rak'ah of a salah, that means they are obligated to pray the salah of that time. So Dhuhr starts at 1 o'clock, a person's cycle starts at 1:30. That means they had half hour to actually pray and they didn't, which means they would have to make it up. Yeah. So the Hanafi school says you don't have to, because it's going to be based on how a person is at the end of the salah time. All right. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallahi wa bihamdihi. La ilaha illallah, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
No more Friday classes, inshallah, until January, right? Jazakallah. Who's here in the front? Isa? Tayyib's here? 6. Amira's here? Who's it? بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Let me give you guys a quiz. There's 24 questions on vocab. Then there's a short section on inna wa akhawatuha. Then you have 10 sentences to translate, and then about 18 short phrases. They're all phrases to vowel. Okay? When you vowel, just be clear in your voweling. Be clear in your voweling. And when you vowel, essentially vowel as much as you can, but essentially what you're being graded on is the end of words, right? It's what i'rab is essentially, right? Does the end the word have is the last letter or last harf, is it a dhamma, fatha, or a kasra? Is that clear? Good. And then Monday we don't have class, right? So it's one of those dangerous 4-day breaks. What happens on Tuesday, Allah understands. You have to do damage control for Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Because what happens to Rama on Saturday? Nothing. No, I'm supposed to say that, Rama. You're supposed to say studying. Yeah. I'm supposed to say nothing happens on Saturday, right? Because, like, you're supposed to go in on Saturday with the hopes of studying. But I tell you what actually happens. So when I ask you what happened on Saturday, you say, inshallah, study. You don't say nothing. But I tell you on Sunday what happened on Saturday or on Monday. Clear? Make sense? All right. And those of you online, I'll upload it within the next 2 minutes, inshallah. Those of you online, once again, if you're online, make sure the voweling part is clear. Make sure the voweling part is clear, which is the last section, so I can see the vowels properly. If I can't see the vowels properly, then automatically I think well of you, but I'll assume you got it wrong.
Those of you online, I just uploaded it. I will end the stream, but it should be
اوكي جزاك الله خير.
Please do double and triple check your answers before you turn it in.
We'll do إن شاء الله.